Good morning, Canada and the United States. My name is Hugh Williams, and I have the privilege of being the moderator today on an exciting broadcast. We'll call it a live broadcast because we've been putting this broadcast together as events change and evolve with the U.S.-Canada border. So on behalf of the Tourism Industry Association, all its members, and also really a big thank you to all of the associations who came together to help make this happen. That includes the Hotel Association of Canada, U.S. Travel Association in the United States. It's our privilege to be here with you today. Also a special shout out to the Frontier Duty Free Association, who's been a big driver of the content for today and a sponsor of the AV. Really, we have groundbreaking material to talk about this morning, and we have a really exciting lineup for you. I'll introduce our panel, but before I do that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context in terms of a last-minute change that we've had to go through, as you do when you're producing a live broadcast. Senator Chuck Schumer, who's the Senate Majority Leader in the U.S. and obviously a huge figure in American politics, had agreed personally to do the panel earlier in the week, and we felt really good about his attendance as we went through the process and the approval of the format and even the technical run through with his team. But unfortunately, late last night, we got a cancellation that the senator was unable to make it, and we're disappointed, but hopefully would be able to have him on at a later date. I'm told by sources in Washington who have been dealing with the White House directly that there may be some context to this. There was a breaking story that the White House leaked to Katie Simpson, who's the CBC reporter for for CBC Washington Bureau on a major donation that took place that was announced at 10:30 this morning of 1 million doses of vaccine from the United States to Canada. And I think that donation is obviously major news here in Canada and obviously a major news initiative by the Biden administration. So perhaps there was some desire not to step on that news. We also understand that there are certainly directly from ministers here on the Canadian side of the border that there are advancing talks on the border, and there will be announcements related to changes coming on the 21st. So we have a lot of moving pieces in place. But from our point of view, we wanted to charge ahead with this important panel and make sure we brought the voices out of both congressional leaders in the United States and also from parliamentarians here, and of course the trade associations that are involved as well. On that point, we've had the privilege of Congressman Chris Jacobs, who's a Republican from Northern New York, the 27th District, who's been a very outspoken proponent of opening up the border and making sure that the border can work better going into this reprieve from COVID that we have. Congressman Jacobs has actually sponsored a bill on the floor of Congress to open the border and has pushed that dialogue in the media and across multiple platforms. Congressman Jacobs had agreed to speak to us next week, but he's agreed to bring up his appearance to speak to us this morning. As we speak, Congressman Jacobs is on the floor of the House of Representatives voting, and he'll be joining us as we bring him later into the conversation. Our other panelists are really a star-studded group of public policy experts, both in the private sector and the public sector. I'd like to begin by just mentioning we're going to have Susie Grynol, who is the President and CEO of the Hotel Association of Canada. This is one of her top priorities, is to make sure that we can get the border open and resume to a normal travel flow between Canada and the U.S. And she's been doing a lot of media on this, a lot of talking to policymakers. And I think bringing her voice is going to be incredibly interesting. We're privileged, of course, to have Tori Barnes, who's the Executive Vice President of the U.S. Travel Association. I joked with Tori earlier that they have the best, most straightforward name in all of trade associations, U.S. Travel. The U.S. Travel Association wants to get the border open. Canadians and Americans need to go over both sides of the border. I was also joking earlier that there's Canadians who are flying down to Montreal to enjoy the hockey game, to watch the Vegas Knights play the Habs, but you can't have a family drive across the Canadian border the other way. So normalizing that is incredibly important to the travel on both sides of the border. And from the Canadian parliamentary perspective, I'm really, really excited to have Nathaniel Erskine-Smith. Nate is a wonderful member of Parliament, elected in 2015 as a member of the Liberal caucus, really one of the most well-liked members of the Liberal caucus, and really a very outspoken member with respect to opening the border on a safe but reasonable pace. And so we're really appreciative that he's been able to join us. And of course, we'll bring in the voice of our host, Beth Potter, who's the new, maybe not so new over the last 5 months. She's probably done 4 years of work in just the few months that she's been head of the association, but has really been driving the conversation on the border, on safe travel, on making sure that the government understands the parameters that the tourism industry is under, and that we don't lose our summer as we get closer and closer to these decision-making points. So with that in mind, thank you for being here. Thank you for being on our broadcast. And I'm going to turn now to Susie Grynol to just give opening remarks, if you would. I'll invite each of the panelists to do that, just to give context in terms of your perspective on this issue. And Susie, we'll bring you into the conversation. Thank you for being here.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks, Hugh. And I'm delighted to join this esteemed group here today to talk about one of the most pressing issues of our time. First, let me start by thanking our American friends on the line for the contribution to Canada of 1 million doses. That is incredibly generous and significant to the conversation that we're about to have today. The top priority for our members, so I represent the hotel industry in Canada, our top priority is the health and safety of our guests and our employees, and of course of all Canadians. Throughout the pandemic, hotels have answered the call from public health, serving as a safe place for frontline workers to self-isolate, repatriated Canadians to quarantine, and vulnerable citizens to shelter. The industry quickly stood up the government-approved accommodation program for returning travelers a couple of months ago, and experts found that likely contributed to quarantine compliance. Earlier this month, Canada's expert advisory panel said it was time to move away from restrictive measures towards a safe, phased reopening based on science. Since then, Canada's first dose vaccination rates have led the world. Our new cases are below 1,000, and even more studies are showing vaccine effectiveness of the effects of COVID-19 on its variants. Our members are fully supportive of the expert panel's report. The time has come for us to transition away from mandatory hotel quarantines and towards a smart border reopening plan. The government's recent announcement to allow fully vaccinated Canadian travelers to re-enter Canada without quarantine requirements is a step in the right direction, but COVID doesn't discriminate by citizenship, and we shouldn't either. The border policy needs to be rooted in science, and the science says that fully vaccinated travelers should be exempt from quarantine. COVID does not check your passport at the border. The government should do the same, should have the same standards for anyone who can prove that they have received 2 doses of an approved vaccine. Many of our allies and trading partners are establishing safe procedures to verify vaccinations and allow travel for fully immunized individuals. Canadians have the evidence and the tools to do the same. You will all remember that after the attacks of 9/11, the United States felt they had to close the border completely. The trucks were backed up for miles in both directions, but within days, our mutual reliance drove us to reopen travel for trucks and low-risk travelers. We have done this before. Within months, our governments signed the first Smart Border Initiative, an evidence-driven plan to reopen to our closest allies, each other. The situation today is the same. The evidence justifies a new Smart Border Initiative with ongoing testing requirements, phased quarantine rules, and careful monitoring. The federal government must follow the advice of the COVID-19 Testing and Screening Expert Advisory Panel, which was a group of physicians and scientists who said it is safe to reopen and it is possible to do so, and they did lay out a phased reopening plan. It is time for the government to provide a clear, timely, and safe guidance on reopening the Canada-US border. Allowing fully vaccinated travelers to enter Canada will reunite families, let American grandparents meet their Canadian grandchildren, and revive the longest undefended border in the world. Without a clear plan in place, we will lose a second tourism season in a row. Canada's vibrant tourism industry could lose the local unique attractions we treasure, the global events our cities compete to host, and the anchor businesses like hotels that enable small town tourism and commerce to exist. People are eager to see our beautiful country again. Our hotel operators are receiving countless inquiries from potential guests with just one question: when can they open travel? When can people travel to Canada? And when can they reopen? Our loyal employees are seeing a resurgence in other sectors, but no plan from the federal government on when they will see steady work again. What we need is certainty. Everyone needs the federal government to table a comprehensive, evidence-based, smart border initiative to allow us to be ready to welcome guests back safely, and the science backs it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. I mean, so many great points to unpack there. So I look forward to coming back to you to really bring those out. But really, we're hearing more and more from across the country about both sides of the border asking for things to be opened up. And I know, Tori, this is I'll bring you into the conversation now. U.S. Travel wants to get the border opened. I understand you're fresh from meetings on the Hill this morning. Thank you for making time to be here. Love to bring you have the perspective of the American Association.
No, thanks. And thanks so much for having me. Here from the United States, 65% of job-related losses as a result of the pandemic are within the travel and tourism industry. And just to give you a sense, U.S. Travel's the umbrella organization representing all sectors of the travel economy here in the U.S. And two things that we're really highly focused on right now, in addition to opening up international travel, is bringing back business meetings and events. We are seeing here in the U.S. an uptick of domestic leisure, but we know that can't make up for all of the losses that we are seeing on the international and business front. Each month that travel from Canada remains at a standstill, the U.S. economy loses $1.5 billion in potential travel exports, which is enough to support more than 10,000 American jobs. And each week, the U.S. loses $340 million. And if travel from Canada returns to just half of the late 2019 levels in Q3 and Q4, an additional $3.3 billion in U.S. export income will be generated. And this, in our view, is achievable if and only if the expected loosening of quarantines affecting air travel from the Canadian government is coupled by a full reopening of the land border. This is a step in which the United States can and must take an active role and prioritize immediately. We were pleased to see the establishment of 4 working groups or task forces here in the U.S., one with Canada, one with UK, one with EU, and one with Mexico last week. But we understand that those meetings are taking place this week, at least with the Canadians. However, we don't think that the expediency is there. We're very much pushing on a time certain and a plan to be able to reopen these international borders as we continue to see increased vaccinations here in the U.S. and a decline in infection rates. We know that now is the time. We're looking otherwise at a 2024, 2025 time horizon for a full recovery. And we know that that's going to mean sustained job losses here in the U.S. And a continued challenge across the entire economy here at home in the U.S. So I look forward to this conversation, but we are very much happy to be partnering here. Opening the U.S.-Canadian border is a high top priority here for U.S. travel.
Great. Thank you, Tori. Really important commentary about the economic consequences. I think oftentimes people don't recognize how large the travel, tourism, accommodation sector is in this country, and how for some of them, there's different elements of the economy that have been shut down measured in weeks, and it's not necessarily a comparison. But when I think of some of Beth's members, the duty-free stores, for example, they've been shut down for 15 months, and it's hard for people in government to really imagine the consequences of a business being shut down for that period of time. So thank you, Tori, for the U.S. perspective. Really helpful. I would now welcome into the conversation our U.S. guest and Representative Chris Jacobs. Chris, thank you very much for being here today. Thank you to your team. They did an amazing job in pivoting to make you available this week as opposed to next week. And I understand you're fresh from the floor of the House, so they kept that feed alive for us. knowing you would join us here. You've been a passionate, outspoken advocate for opening the border. You have a piece of legislation you've introduced to help drive that conversation. We'd love to hear from you and welcome you to the conversation on both sides of the border. Over to you, Representative Jacobs.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and trying to do everything you can to elevate this issue so we get some movement on it. And I represent the 27th Congressional District, which is all are part of 8 counties a lot of that along the border from Erie County, where I'm from, to the outskirts of Rochester and Monroe County. But just personally, I grew up in the city of Buffalo and grew up spending every single summer at our cottage in Fort Erie in Canada. So these last two summers, this summer and last summer, probably the first time in my entire life I've not been in Canada. And, you know, I speak to the fact that we are one region and 2 countries. We always have been. And also on a personal note, my wife is Canadian, and my mother-in-law lives in Kitchener. So my daughter's not seen her grandmother for 16 months. So, you know, when I participated in an event several weeks ago with many family members that have endured family separation, and it is very, very difficult. So whether it be, you know, I know we're here to talk about tourism, but property owners, but family members in particular, and trying to get some rational policy on that is a little more compassionate on that first and foremost. But our economies are very much intertwined, and we very much benefit from and enjoy Canadians coming to patronize our sporting events, our ski resorts, and everything, our festivals, and vice versa. And so we need to understand that, you know, we are dealing with coming out of a global pandemic, but we can reopen, and we can reopen safely. I was heartened to see that the U.S. is announced today they're donating another 1 million COVID vaccines to Canada to help to make sure that the vaccinations continue to progress. But I think the complete lockdown that we've experienced is just not consistent with science, and it's very, very bad for our economy. So I've tried to elevate this issue. I've also, as you mentioned, introduced legislation really on obviously dealing with our side of the border to call the Northern Border Reopening Transparency Act. And basically this asks for the administration, the Biden administration, to report back to the Congress on what they've been doing here in terms of negotiations with the Canadian government. What has the Department of Health and Human Services done? What has CDC done? The Biden administration, I think in the second day, probably the day after they terminated the Keystone Pipeline, unfortunately, is they the executive order mandated it in 14 days to report on what was being done on a binational basis to have a reopening plan. And we have not heard a thing. So I think last week there was discussions of creating a working group, which really shocked me that now at this point in time. So it didn't seem like there was a lot of focus on it. We need laser focus on this. Every day that is delayed is a day that people are going to make travel plans to not to go somewhere else. And, you know, if we open in mid-August, you know, I don't know how helpful that will be because everybody have already scheduled things elsewhere, and Canadians in Canada and Americans elsewhere. And so I'm doing everything I can, but I will just say I'm open for ideas. If anybody can think of other lever points, I'm happy to exercise them and try to do what I can here. I think that we seemed to get a little bit of discussion last week, but I didn't sense it was really tangible, real change. And we need real change and clarity. And I know we're coming up on the July and June 21st date and what we're going to hear there. And I really, really hope it's not more of the same. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions and thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you, Representative Jacobs. You would have missed just slightly earlier on the really grateful thank you that Susie Grynol gave on behalf of Canadians for the donations. I mean, it's quite emotional how supportive the Americans have been, and the American administration, the American people, with respect to sharing the vaccination. So it's quite profound, and so I offer all of the thanks of Canadians for that. Thank you for your good work on this. I too married an American as a Canadian, and I've got my kids have joint citizenship, and I think there's, for people that don't know, there's just a huge community that crosses the border every year for family reunions, family reunification. Wayne Easter, the chair of the Canada-U.S. Parliamentary Council, really spoke about Americans coming to PI, but it works both ways. Where my kids go to see their American grandparents every summer in Michigan, and it's important that we stay together as a society. So thank you for that. I'm going to continue the conversation and then come back to, I think, where I really want to tease out some of the bipartisan elements of this, because I think it's important that we're hearing from both sides of the House and the Senate that this should really move, and of course from the President. But I'll turn now to our Canadian parliamentarian, Nate Erskine-Smith. Nate, your riding and really the entire city of Toronto depends on tourism in a really important way. Susie's members of the hotels there have been on their knees in terms of occupancy. Love to hear your perspective on the border as you've been outspoken on it.
Thanks very much. So first, I would echo the thanks for the partnership with our American allies, and thanks for the donation of vaccines. It's only going to help get us closer to reopening the border as we see fully vaccinated populations on both sides. I would also say it's good to share space with Susie, who I'm a member of the industry committee, and she's attended previously on behalf of the hotel associations. I think we all recognize, both as Canadian representatives and as American representatives, that our obligation as representatives is to protect the safety of our citizens. And we can understand some hesitancy here, right? Because there has been, at least on the Canadian side, at times a rush to reopen, and there's been, I think, a false conflict between the economy and our health. And we've seen a rush to reopen that has then undermined health and then has undermined that economic recovery in a way that is, I think, unfortunate. And so we can understand some hesitancy, but the fundamental point here is, just as we have an expectation that our representatives follow the science to impose public health restrictions on our behalf, we also ought to have an expectation that they follow the science in lifting those restrictions. And when we see the guidance from the US CDC, when we see the guidance from the Canadian Expert Advisory Panel, which includes, by the way, Dr. David Naylor, who is the chair of our co-chair of the Immunity Task Force, who led the review of SARS. It includes Kieran Moore, who is now the Chief Public Health Officer here in Ontario. These are serious individuals who have basically said, we need a phased reopening, and we can allow for quarantine-free travel for fully vaccinated individuals with proof of immunity. And let's recognize some challenges, right? So when we see some states and our American friends say, we don't want to have so-called vaccine passports. And so proof of immunity is not going to be easy in every circumstance. But when we see the state of New York with an Excelsior application that can easily integrate with the ArriveCAN app, there are obvious opportunities for allowing freer travel in the immediate term. And when we think of phases, we're in the phase approach, by the way, to take a step back. The first phase that Canada has now committed to is to say existing eligible travelers as of sometime in early July will be free from quarantine upon a pre-arrival test, and then upon an arrival test proving negative, will be free from quarantine. And that's an important step. It will positively impact many people, especially as it relates to family reunification. I would say, though, it isn't fast enough or further enough in keeping with the science. And we can, in phase one, immediately where we have proof of immunity on both sides, and we can come to these agreements, we can immediately reopen the border for fully vaccinated individuals for the sake of family reunification, for the sake of cross-border commerce and the Canadian businesses and American businesses that depend on that kind of travel. And then just as our domestic jurisdictions, our provincial and state jurisdictions have reopening plans with particular metrics of single vaccination and full vaccinations, so too our partnership across the relationship that we have and the border that we share, this long-standing partnership, we should have metrics that are clearly articulated and a medium-term plan, I would say, to reopen the border fully based upon vaccination rates. And so I will continue to call for this, and insofar as my role is not as a decision maker per se, but as someone who can continue to push the government to move more quickly in keeping with the science. And so I happy to answer questions alongside Chris and Susie and Tori and others. But, we all need to raise our voices and say, we need a safe and science-based reopening.
Yeah, so appreciate it. I mean, your voice as a member of parliament is incredibly important in this. And I think, it's really reflective of where the industry is. Everybody within the travel and tourism industry has been happy to accept, science meant we had to have it closed to be as safe as possible. But when science goes the other way, we have to make things happen. And just on behalf of, the travel and tourism industry and the entire economy, I think the Prime Minister, your government, deserves real credit for the procurement of vaccinations, the partnerships with the province to roll out the vaccinations. I think that's part of the story here. The incredible, Canada-wide push led by the federal government on this has been amazing. And now we've got to take steps to react to that success is part of the equation. So thank you for bringing those elements in. Beth, if you would, you're a host here today. Just a couple of comments to bring this all together, and then I'll go to kind of a rapid fire question period.
Thanks, Hugh, and I want to thank all the panelists for being here. Everything that you've raised is something we've been talking about now for weeks, and every day I get a phone call from business owners in Canada who have been directly impacted by the fact that the border is closed. There's this human factor. I mean, yes, the economics of it are significant, they're staggering, but the human factor that we need to keep in mind, in addition to reuniting families, is that we have displaced over 500,000 people from their jobs, and we need to get them back to work. We have caused family-run businesses to tap into their savings in order to stay afloat and take on debt that wasn't part of the plan, and through no fault of their own. And so we've got businesses who are now, facing years of paying back that debt. So they're going to be paying for this pandemic for a very long time. And every month that the border remained closed means that we're adding costs directly into the pocketbooks of these businesses. So it's really important that we continue to do everything possible to try and get to the point where we've got a plan to open the border. Yes, do it safely. The expert advisory panel has recommendations based on science, and we can do this. If we can, as somebody mentioned earlier, if the NHL can move back and forth across the border in order to play in the Stanley Cup playoff games, then why can't the rest of Canadians? Why can't Americans be coming into Canada to do business, to attend business meetings? Let's look at how we can do this safely. We're watching other countries, they're doing it safely. Tori and I were talking the other day, and she was telling me about, a trade show in Vegas with 30,000 attendees. That is something that we need to start looking at again here in Canada. We need to be able to do that again in Canada in order to help our industry recover and get those folks back to work. And I will just say that, our Dr. Tam, who's the head of our public health authority, she came out a few weeks ago and said, once we get to 75% of first dose of vaccine and 20% of second dose vaccine, we can start to ease restrictions without putting an undue burden on our healthcare system. Well, we're going to get there this week. That's how well the vaccine rollout has been going. And to get to 75% of second dose, we can get there by early July. And so let's use that modeling, and let's use it to define a plan to reopen so that these businesses can start to plan their own reopening, and they can begin to hire people back. They can begin to, do all those technical things that they need to do in order to get their businesses ramped up and ready to go.
Thank you, Beth. I'll bring our American colleagues back into the conversation now. Congressman Jacobs, if I could, just to tease out the environment in Washington on this. I mean, certainly you referenced that President Biden called for a plan on this in his first few days of office, but it seems like that there's lots of talk around this, but very little concrete action. We saw a little break on that this week with Minister LeBlanc, I think, in Canada, who's responsible for intergovernmental affairs, really seemed to strongly hint that there was going to be some sort of news. I think the entire travel industry and the business community overall is worried about a little bit of a lunch bag letdown on that. But how hard is the administration in the U.S. pushing, and how important is that bipartisanship, so that this is, there's a lot of issues that divide people in Washington these days, but this certainly seems to be one issue that representatives on both sides of the aisle agree on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just if you're along the border and it's very bipartisan, that's a good thing. So that we have the Northern Border Caucus, which is bipartisan, chaired by Brian Higgins, who's a friend and border his district, and Elise Stefanik from the North Country, who's a Republican. They've been strong and vocal, as you know, and I think Brian spoke to you as well. I don't think up till last week, there was much of, and it just didn't seem like there was sufficient focus here. Last week I heard, in response to some of the attention this issue has gotten, the Biden administration had created some working groups, which again, I was disappointed that it didn't happen a long time ago, but it did seem like that was progress. I don't know what came out of the discussions, between President Biden and the Prime Minister at the summit, but I would hope it's positive that they at least met and talked about the issue. I know that there's discussions here by some saying if on June 21st, if there's an announcement that we continue status quo on the Canadian side, maybe we should look to doing something unilateral on the American side. It would be the administration's call on that. But this is good news about the 75-20 that was just mentioned. And our area, I think, is hitting 70 this week. So, we're progressing well in our area. So again, I think the science would say, as Nathan mentioned, that we should at minimum be able to allow vaccinated people to go over at this point and come our way.
Yeah, I'll stick with you for a second, Congressman. One of Beth's prominent members, a store owner in Windsor, made the point earlier this week that there's kind of an economic unfairness that people have been allowed to fly across the border.
Absolutely.
You can fly down to Florida if you can afford it. We even had a case here in Canada where people took a helicopter across the border and had their car shipped across the border so they could then drive down from there. And but for the average family who's along the border, they can't get across the border, and I just think that is that issue of the unfairness, not matching up with the science.
Absolutely. I'll say, my mother-in-law, I guess we could have her come over, but she works. So I mean, if she comes back and quarantines for 14 days, so it's not, she's a working person, so absolutely it's unfair. And I think that why land travel is treated differently. Certainly there's no science to that at all, but the fairness issue is just profound. Yes, we've raised that issue, and it's one of the things I think that needs to be addressed.
This next question to you, Tori, and then I'll throw it to some of our other panelists. I mean, we've talked a lot about the tourism, the human side of it, the travel, the job side of it in tourism, and I think all of those things are tremendously important. But of course, there's a larger business community. The auto sector has been calling for, the need for expertise to be able to travel on both sides of the border, and the ability that our economies are so integrated. Here in Canada, Beth and Susie took part in a broad press conference. Parent Beatty, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, called for opening the border. Are we seeing that develop in the United States from a larger business community point of view? Because we have companies that operate on both sides of the border that are fundamental to the North American economy's success.
Absolutely. I mean, I have Ford stamping plant in my district, which definitely, I mean, the majority of that goes up to Canada. I used to represent Tonawanda, which is the GM plant, and then a lot of suppliers, the former Harrison Radiator in Lockport area. I've seen the chambers get more vocal lately, which I was glad to see. I think that they're an important voice, and I think that we need to, at every avenue. I certainly, I'd say the family separation is the most compelling. Just obviously for obvious reasons, but I would hope that this. I think COVID, at least what I've seen here, one thing that would be a bright spot is it did show us how interconnected rather, our economy is, and issues of supply chain and so forth. I think that I hope that we can use this as to highlight again how interconnected our region is, our binational region is, and it would be the same all along the border. But how our countries together are so largest trading partner and so forth. That we can highlight this more. So I think the more the chambers and business organizations, obviously tourism, can be vocal. I think that we just need to kind of continue to build this, and not as we just don't want it to settle back in and more of the same. It's just we need to. The science says we can do it. We need now it to translate into real, tangible policy, and not the bare minimum, but what science says can be done in a safe way. And we're hitting metrics now, that I think should say it really is time.
And just to piggyback on that, I would say we are, from a U.S. travel standpoint, engaging with the broader, travel industry here, obviously, but we are engaging with the broader business community as well. In this next pressure point that we're about to focus on, we have sent at least from our corporate CEOs within the travel industry, a letter to the president. We've had our destination marketing organization send a letter. All the Gateway Airport directors have signed a letter. We continue to have meetings with the secretaries, Buttigieg and Mayorkas and Raimondo, who, quite frankly, Mayorkas and Raimondo are big, I think, champions of the industry and would like to see things move forward. And so, I think we need to your point, get the broader industry, and we are currently working on that right now, to engage and be part of this effort, because obviously the trade and travel go so hand in hand. And quite frankly, when you think about it from a U.S. standpoint, travel from the key European markets as well as Canada are still registering in declines of 98% below 2019 levels. So from our biggest trading partners and our closest allies, we're having the most significant declines in international inbound travel. And we have folks coming in from other countries that weren't part of the 212F, that were, not part of the travel restrictions. And so it really doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not based on science when you get down to it on that front. And we do know, if we're talking just about, let's say, air travel, there's some recent Mayo Clinic data that shows that, and I know we're talking about Canada here, but if we were to open the air travel corridor with the UK, let's say, there's a 1 in 1 million chance that someone would be able to, would get COVID. The risk is very, very, very low. And our government right now has a zero risk tolerance, and that's just not sustainable for the long term. So we are demanding, that they take action and put a clear timeline in place. And we'd really like to see our economies open up with Canada, with the UK, as early as July. We cannot wait any longer.
Yeah, and I think, you thank you for being part of this. I think to have the Tourism Industry Association of Canada and U.S. Travel, both speaking to this issue with representatives from both governments, I think is terrific. Susie, let me bring in, you've told some really heartfelt stories about, how your operators are really struggling and, have been the hardest hit, and you've led the hardest hit coalition. in many ways. Any sense of like, can your members hang on? And also, I don't get the sense that everybody in government, and this isn't disrespectful to any public servant, when you haven't missed a paycheck throughout this whole process, you maybe don't get the urgency of what it's like to take on the debt or not have a job or be dependent on government programs, all of which are appreciated. But I've heard you talk about how hard your members have been hit and their employees.
Yeah, I mean, this has just been, we talk about unprecedented. I mean, it's been the most painful experience of all for our operators who, I think people always assume that the Marriott and Hiltons actually own these properties. They don't. It's people in the communities. Nate, I'm sure you know a bunch of hoteliers in your communities who've invested their livelihoods into the local hotel. A hotel can't be repurposed for anything else. You can't switch to online services. You can't do curbside pickup. Our inventory expires every single night, and we have big assets that we have to maintain where those fixed costs are there, whether you have people coming in of your hotel or not. You've got your insurance costs. You've got your cost of keeping the building afloat. Canada's cold. You've got to make sure the facilities is heated. These owners they are at a breaking point. The last member survey we had showed that 70% of our membership of the hotels in Canada will not make it to the end of the year without more government support. Like, I'm just going to let that sink in for a second. 70%. That means we could lose the critical infrastructure. And what that means is for communities who have the one or two local hotels, those hotels are closing down. You can't even get essential services up into the north. For communities who rely on tourism, what's the first thing you do? You book a hotel. You're not going if there's nowhere to stay. We are going to see a breakdown of the infrastructure that supports our communities and supports commerce. It's going to break down what allows Canada to compete for these international business events and conferences and sporting events. Our downtown cores have been sitting at 90% losses for 15 months. We've not had a recovery in Canada. And it's different than, the hardware store where you can sell nails the very next day when you move from one phase to the next. We don't have lineups outside our hotels. Our hotels are empty and they're dying. And I just don't think there's enough of an appreciation for how critical a state we're in here in Canada. If you think about the seasonal aspect of Canada, our summers are 75% of our international visitors. Of the tourists, the tourist season in Canada, 75% of it in the summer are international visitors. Of that 75%, 50% are Americans. And if we have the majority of Americans already now double vaccinated, there is no scientific reason why they can't be coming and spending those dollars in Canada, and for having our Canadian visitors who want to go to the US. Our countries are so interconnected. I grew up on a border town. We went to the movies in the US. We got, Americans came over and got milk in Canada. Like, it was, we are just so connected. And I just think there's no science at this point that backs up the restrictive approach that we still have. And the human and economic costs are going to devastate our country in such a way we are not going to look the same on the other side of this.
Yeah, and Nate, I'll bring you back into this because I think your call to following the science and mentioning the CDC and the advisory panel is really important. I think you also brought up a very important issue with respect to the vaccination, proof of vaccination. I'm one who has a great deal of confidence in our border guards on both sides of the border who look at documents all the time to see if your pet's been vaccinated, to see if the customs duty is there. I really just think we're at a stage where an American and a Canadian, or reaching that stage, are as safe as anybody on either side, if you follow that logic. But also that if we do put systems in place, we don't need one magical system that's interconnected in order to make progress. So any thoughts on what you see as the barriers to making this happen in Ottawa? I mean, I think that you mentioned the cautiousness that exists around this, and how some of that is fair. And maybe one kind of supplementary to that question, at the risk of giving a double barrel question, I had a public policy expert tell me that all governments, regardless of in democracies, are too slow to respond to crisis, and then they're too slow to come out of the crisis. Do you think that's kind of what we're seeing here? A lot to unpack there.
Well, I think as a general criticism, governments are often slow on all sorts of measures. But so when we look to the specific situation before us, I would just echo Susie's commentary. We have asked a lot of the service and tourism and hospitality sector. We've asked a great deal of those whose livelihood depends upon tourism to say, we're going to shut your sector down in the interest of public health. And that was the right decision. And we provided significant financial support as a federal government to say there will be a wage subsidy, there will be a commercial rent subsidy, there will be SIBA for smaller operators, there will be ways of bridging businesses, and then employees who were laid off, there's going to be CERB for you. There were significant financial supports to bridge individuals and businesses through this pandemic, and there was a commitment to follow the science in imposing those restrictions. And I personally think, based on the feedback we got through the industry hearings and in my conversations with those who operate businesses, they understood that sacrifice was necessary. But it is not necessary anymore in relation to fully vaccinated travelers. And where there is an opportunity to say, you have sacrificed a great deal, so we are going to do everything we can as a government to ensure that you don't have to sacrifice anymore, and we're going to follow the science in doing so, we should take those, we should take on that challenge, and we shouldn't hesitate. And so I personally don't think that the practical challenges of the verification and proof of immunity is a reason to continue to ask the tourist sector and tourism sector to sacrifice, frankly. When you look at I mentioned the Excelsior app from New York, but there are, in Ontario, we have, yes, a different proof of immunity than in BC. But you're absolutely right. The border officers are capable, and more than that, government officials on both sides are more than capable of establishing what documents will be required for proof of immunity from different jurisdictions. And yes, border officers are able to say, well, you're coming from Ontario, let's look at this piece. Well, you're coming from New York, let's look at this piece. And there are even better ways, as I mentioned, to integrate through the ArriveCan app, which can integrate with these other applications. So that practically presents an obstacle for a short time potentially in hammering these details out. All the more reason to do it now in partnership with individual states that have these systems in place, because I can tell you, yes, Canada relies a great deal upon American tourism. And I have family in Michigan, and it's wild to me that my brother-in-law has been vaccinated for months, can't visit his dad in Kamlaki, Ontario, but he can't because he's got a family and he would have to quarantine for 2 weeks. We all have stories like this, but this is a global challenge, right? This is not a problem that is only faced by Canada and the United States. So if we can't sort it out, as between ourselves, how do we expect to sort it out as in relation to other countries around the world? So I think we have to seize this opportunity to say we are going to solve this problem collectively together now, and it'll be a baseline then for solving this problem in our relationships with every other country and travelers from elsewhere. And so personally, I think the hesitation is, yes, we want to see a cautious approach through, and there are public health experts who would say, well, we can't reopen the border yet fully. And there are even public health experts I've seen who have criticized the expert panel's report to say, well, instead of just a test upon arrival, we want a pre-departure test too for fully vaccinated individuals. So be it. Pre-departure test on arrival. I don't care at this point. Just immediately open the border to fully vaccinated individuals with a system in place, follow that science, and enable businesses to, they're still going to struggle. This isn't a full reopening in the immediate term. They're still going to struggle, but make sure we support them in every way possible, given the sacrifice that they've made.
Hear, hear.
Love the passion. Thank you very much. Congressman Jacobs, I know you have to run, so I'm going to give you the last, give us your 1 minute wrap up, and then I'll go to every other panelist to take us to conclusion. Fire away, Congressman.
Oh, I just thank you for having me on. Every discussion like this helps me be more steeped in the issues and understand the perspective on the Canadian side a little better. I just would say that the more we can do this and help elevate this issue, I think it will help move this along on both sides. So please use me as a resource any way you think I can be helpful on this side in my role. We need to get reopened and do it as soon as possible. So again, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, and thank you, Congressman, for joining us, particularly thank you, Hannah, and your team, who did a great job in making sure you were able to slide in from the House floor. Thanks for being here. Tori, we'll go to you next, again from the U.S. side of the equation.
Sure. No, thanks so much. I'll just reiterate again from a U.S. perspective that each month that travel from Canada remains at a standstill, the U.S. economy loses $1.5 billion in potential travel exports, which support more than 10,000 jobs. That's each month. And each week, the U.S. loses $340 million. Not to mention all of the other really important points that you all have made around the families and the friends, and just the state of our economies being so intertwined. So we are going to continue to push very hard to get our border open on the U.S. side, and push the administration to make some changes and put that timeline in place and to reopen, because we can't continue this. The economy continues to suffer greatly, even though we make great strides in the health arena. And at the end of the day, echo that at a minimum for vaccinated travelers, they should be able to go back and forth. But really, as we continue to have increased vaccinations here in the U.S., we should really be able to welcome folks from Canada and from all over the world. So thanks for being here, and look forward to continuing to work with Beth and Susie and all of you here. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tori, and thank you, Congressman Jacobs, again for the American, kindness and your partnership on the vaccine front. Canadians won't forget it. Just before I turn to Susie on the jobs front, we talk about the 10,000 jobs. I think nobody does it better than President Biden in talking about, a job isn't just a statistic, but it's the base of what it means to a family. And I think we can't forget that in the tourism sector on both sides of the border, how much that really means in terms of dignity and meaning. Susie?
Yeah, I think what we're suggesting here, like we've sacrificed a lot in the travel and tourism industry. We've done our part to keep people safe. The science now suggests that it is okay for us to reopen. And no one's suggesting a wild west approach here where we just open to everybody, anti-vaxxers, et cetera, that we don't have a system in place. We have scientists and an expert panel report that has clearly laid out how this is possible. But there just doesn't seem to be a sense of urgency that this is an issue that we should solve. And I know a lot of this has to do with public opinion, but public opinion is shifting, and there is so much at stake here. And I just I want to thank TIAC for bringing us all together to have this conversation. I want to thank Nate and Representative Jacobs for all of your work on both sides of the border. It is going to take a lot of heavy lifting for us to move this, and I can't think of anything that's more important. So thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Susie. Nate, closing comment?
Just that to your earlier comment and to Susie's last comment about public opinion and shifting public opinion, I think we all need to raise our voices to ensure that public opinion does shift, that we are emphasizing this is about safe travel. This is about ensuring that fully vaccinated travelers can travel free from quarantine, and that we continue to follow the best evidence that we have to keep our citizens safe, but that we also ensure that there is a focus on livelihoods, and where we can ensure that we support those livelihoods, that we do so following the science. And so we all need to lift our voices and continue to lift our voices to shift that public opinion so political decision makers can follow the science and support those livelihoods as they need to.
Nate, thank you for being here. Thanks for your role as a member of Parliament. Hugely important to have you as part of the voice on here. Beth, I'll give you the last word. You're our host today, the one that brought us all together. What's your closing thoughts?
Well, I want to thank everybody that joined us here today. It's a real life example of the work that we're doing collaboratively behind the scenes, and it really demonstrates that as we come together, there's strength in numbers, there's strength in multiple voices. We're all saying the same thing. We're all saying, let's get the border open. Let's do it in a safe way. If we have to do it in a phased way, that's okay. But we need some clarity, and we need it now. So I just want to thank Susie and Nate and Tori and Representative Jacobs for being here today. And I look forward to continually working with all of you so that we can realize this goal of getting the Canada-US border open again and the resumption of international travel between our two countries.
Yeah, and thank you, Beth. Hopefully, we'll have some news to build on over the next few days as we come to the 21st. We'll have to keep our analysis fresh on that. Obviously, I want to thank TIAC for pulling us all together. Also, thank FDFA again for their tireless work on this issue. As the Frontier Duty Free Association, stores have been closed for 15 months. They were kind enough to sponsor the AV on this, but also to drive the conversation with decision makers on both sides of the border. And thank you, everybody, for being on the panel. Thank you for those watching, and we'll sign off now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.